My father sewed my mouth shut and I dared not speak again. When I was 10 years old, she asked me to remove the stitches and pointed to my mother's swollen belly and said that was my son. After I couldn't figure it out for a while, he killed a chicken to scare the monkey and my only teammate, the yellow dog. I cried and said, "Mom is pregnant with a boy." There was only one sentence left, I said secretly. "He is going to kill his parents?" That day my father was very happy. He did not sew my mouth immediately but allowed me to eat at the table. There was a pot of meat on the table, which was rare, so my mother happily picked up a piece for me. The first time I ate meat, it was really delicious. As far as I can remember, I always ate leftover rice that was mashed into a paste. Because the mouth was sewn shut with blood-red thread, all food was fed in through a hose pressed against the tongue. I don't know what this thread is made of, but I can't break it. Only a rusty file can break it. My dad would change the stitches regularly, muttering to himself while threading the needle. I never understood what he was doing and what I had done wrong. I used my gums to chew the minced meat bit by bit, thinking this would be a new beginning. No more having your mouth sewn together, no more being laughed at. But when the last piece of meat was still on the tip of my tongue, my father had already prepared the needle and thread. "Look up," he said. Seeing me in a daze, he pinched my chin and asked, "What are you waiting for?" My father was so happy that he drank 2 tails of wine. His hands were not steady and he pierced the hole next to his lips several times, causing blood to ooze out. "Give your son some blessings." My mother couldn't bear it and wanted to take over. My father was worried about her, so he glanced at her and said, "You can't sew it tight. Go and give the remaining dog meat to your Uncle Oliver, and tell him that we don't have much rope left." My mother said okay, picked up the only pot of meat on the table and hesitated for a moment before leaving. It turned out that the meat belonged to the big yellow dog. My stomach suddenly churned and the meat on the tip of my tongue became a trigger. I vomited with a and the filth oozed out from the half of my mouth that was not sewn shut. My dad slapped me on the face and said, "You're so dirty, go wash it." Looking at my ugly face, half human, half ghost, reflected in the water tank, I finally accepted the rumors of the villagers. I was a raised word spirit. Using the sound of water to mask my prayer, I said word by word, "Daddy's son will kill Mom and Dad." Murakami also has a word spirit called the Mute Woman. It was because of her that I first doubted my identity. The old people in the village were chatting and said that there was a good-for-nothing who was driven out by his master and bought a deserted house in the corner of the village to live in. I heard that he said something he shouldn't have said and it came true. He had his tongue pulled out by the master and was kicked out. Aunt Vera waved a palm leaf fan to hide her mysterious expression and dark eye sockets. The punishment is too light. The master is really merciful. Grandma Luna spat. "Why do you think she came here? It's still old Oliver." Grandma Luna had just answered half a sentence when she saw me approaching and stopped talking. I was used to it, so I lowered my head and walked away, but I bumped into other children. They chased me with stones and hit me, and I ran to the corner of the village for some unknown reason. The children saw the deserted house from a distance and scattered away, shouting as they ran, "Old witch who eats people, run away." I stood there, looking at the deserted house that had been simply renovated, and I couldn't help but be stunned. The mountain of garbage that was originally piled up at the entrance was moved away, and plants were planted, with new sprouts emerging. There is a chicken coop next to it with chicks chirping. The Mute Woman followed the sound and took a handful of millet from the bowl and sprinkled it in the chicken coop. Then she caught sight of me and stopped. I thought she was just like everyone else. I turned around and tried to leave, but was tripped by Xiao Huang, who was still a wild dog at that time. My knee hit the stone and cut a bloody wound. The Mute Woman came to help me up and wiped the blood with her clean sleeve. She was gentle and careful, but after seeing her face clearly, I felt scared. Her face was covered in wrinkles and there were holes around her lips, some so large that her gums were exposed. I even suspected that this was my old self. I was too scared to move. After the bleeding in her leg was stopped, the Mute Woman nodded to me with a smile, her eyes a little soft. "I can laugh when I get older." My stiff heart softened a little. Afterwards, the Mute Woman sent me home, letting me walk with a limp without urging me. But when my dad saw the Mute Woman, he waved his hands like crazy and shouted, "Go away." The Mute Woman ignored him but smiled and waved goodbye to me. I stood leaning against the wall and saw panic on my dad's face. That night, my father beat me severely and forbade me to see the Mute Woman again. Who can resist the temptation of a child who has eaten sweets? I would always sneak to my mute mother-in-law's house while I was picking mushrooms on the mountain. She taught me how to read and write and showed me the meanings of words by gestures. I gradually learned to write "rice sprouts and chickens grow up." "I want to leave." On the night I accepted that I was a spirit of words, I took advantage of my parents' sleep, held the skin of rhubarb, and went to the mute woman's house in the dark. I wrote on the paper, "I won't leave, I want to see them." The mute woman didn't teach me how to write the word death, so I ran my hand across my neck. Not long after, my mother was about to give birth, and it was premature. She was in pain for days, rolling around on the bed, and fainted several times. Our village is far from the city, and the mountain roads are difficult to walk on. Only Andrew, a barefoot village doctor, and the midwife were able to take care of the matter. But after all the trouble, they both persuaded my father to send the baby to the hospital. My dad hesitated for a moment, then pulled me to his side and asked, "Daisy, you said this baby is a boy, is that true?" I nodded, my tongue was pressed by the plastic tube and I could only mumble "Hmm." My father slapped his thigh and said, "Let's go to the hospital." While Andrew was riding the electric Oliver, my mother screamed and gave birth. After the midwife examined the baby, she was shocked and said, "This little kid is so small, but he wants to tear his mother alive." My dad rushed forward, spread the kid's legs apart, and laughed when he saw it was a boy. My mom also tried to laugh when she saw my dad's reaction. But she fainted after only 2 laughs. Andrew came by at that moment, his brows furrowed so tightly that they could kill a few flies. He said 2 words in a deep voice. "Why isn't the baby crying? This woman is in suspense." The midwife was probably too tired to react, and then she picked up my brother's legs and slapped them hard. The little boy, who was not much bigger than a palm, had his skin gradually turning purple, but he still didn't cry. I stared at him intently. No one cared about his life or death more than I did. This has to do with whether what I say comes true. After thinking for a moment, my eyes fell on my father's waistband, where a bunch of keys and a file for cutting ropes were hanging. Just as I reached out to grab them, I suddenly heard a wah cry. My brother's cry was so loud that it attracted the barking of wild dogs in the village. Andrew gasped and said, "Okay, you cried very vigorously, he should be able to survive." My father turned his head to thank Andrew, but found that his hand was on my mother's chest, pressing it again and again. His eyes turned red with anger and he yelled, "You took advantage of my wife." As soon as he finished speaking, he started punching Andrew. After being punched, he still struggled to save the man and repeatedly explained that this was cardiopulmonary resuscitation. My dad was a rough man who lived off the land and didn't know anything about CPR. At this moment his blood boiled and he punched my mom. Oddly enough, after a few punches, the frequency was about the same as Andrew's CPR, and my mother whimpered and woke up. Andrew spat out a mouthful of blood foam. "You're lucky, let's see how long you can be well. No matter what happens at home, even if you invite me in a sedan chair, I won't come." After saying that, he left. The midwife was dumbfounded after watching the chaos. She said hesitantly, "Your wife and the baby are weak, and you still expect the doctor to see them." "You." My dad glared at me and said, "I won't ask him for help, the guy at home." My mom tried her best to pull my dad to stop him from saying anything else. Seeing this, the midwife pushed the baby into my father's arms, asked for her reward and left. I cleaned up the mess, feeling disappointed. That kid looks frail and weak, and doesn't look like he has the strength to kill someone. My mom clearly went to the gates of hell, but how come she came back after going around in circles? Is the word spirit a fake? I dare not think about it too much. The hope I just found is still very fragile and cannot withstand any doubt. 2 days after giving birth, my mother became weaker and weaker. She was breathing more than she was breathing in, and she had no milk to feed my brother. My dad was a little dissatisfied. Whenever my brother started crying, he would grumble, "You're worse than a hen laying eggs. Why don't you just give birth to eggs but take care of them? You just sleep all day long." But occasionally my mother would wake up and ask to hug her son. But my dad looked at her chest and rejected her with a look of disgust. "You are sick, don't pass your illness on to my son." He turned his head to look at me and said, "Go and make some rice soup and feed them." My dad was very tired. After giving me instructions, he fell asleep with his head on the pillow, and his snoring was mixed with laughter. I cooked the rice and brought it to the Kong, thinking that I would feed my brother first and then take care of my mother. But she woke up and called me like a cat, "Bring your brother to me so I can see him." I didn't want to pay attention to her, and I didn't dare to agree to her. If my dad woke up and knew that I disobeyed him, he would beat me again. My mother was so anxious that she even had the energy to yell, "You loser, there's dog hair in your ears. Bring your brother here so I can see him." The screaming woke up my dad, who got up very angry and kicked me back a few steps. "You can't even handle such a small thing and you're disturbing my sleep." With red eyes and gritting his teeth, he stretched out his arms, pulled me to his side and started hitting me. The joy of having a son was not enough to smooth out his anger towards life, so he could only beat me to vent his anger. The series of noises woke up the sleeping baby, and he burst into tears. My father turned a deaf ear to me and was just beating me. Taking advantage of this opportunity, my mother turned over and crawled to the other side of the Kong, hugging my brother in her arms. My brother really stopped crying and laughed out loud. The laughter was very weak, but it seemed to have divine power, stopping my father's violence and drawing his attention away. My father turned his head and saw the little man staring at my mother, and my mother's clothes on her chest were soaked. "Why are you in a daze? Hurry up and feed the baby." My father changed into a different person and came forward with a smile on his face. My mother was also overjoyed. She lifted her clothes and fed him. "Our son is so cute." As soon as she finished speaking, she cried out in pain, and after a moment she explained, "Our son is really strong, his bite hurts so much." The family seemed to be enjoying themselves. My brother was full, and when he pushed his tongue against the food, my mother gasped. She looked at her blood-stained body, frowned and turned to me. "What are you looking at? Bring me a wet cloth, you have no eyesight." I wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth with my sleeve, then staggered to my feet to get the cloth. Late at night, my mother woke up and wanted to feed my brother, but found that my brother was burning hot. She woke my father up, and my father put on his shoes and went to find Andrew. "Let Daisy go." My mother hurriedly stopped my father and winked at him. He remembered beating Andrew and listened to my mom. "If you can't call anyone, you'll have no chance of survival," my father said to me viciously, and when he turned to look at my brother, his face was full of concern. Just like that, without even a flashlight, my father pushed me into the dark night. That night was windless, cloudless, and moonless. I stumbled a lot and finally reached Andrew's house, but couldn't knock on the door. The light next to Andrew was on, and Noah was cursing. "Stop knocking. He has gone to the countryside and will be back tomorrow." "Whose family are you from?" "I asked him to find you when he comes back." "Speak now. Are you dumb? Are you fucking sick?" His shouting and cursing, mixed with the sound of the iron door opening and closing, accompanied me on my way home. The whole way I was thinking about how to explain the situation to my parents. Writing is not the solution. They can't read or write, and I don't want them to know that I can write. But as soon as I stepped into the yard, I heard my father screaming. "What's going on?" After I opened the door, my dad quickly pushed me aside and peered out the door. When he didn't see Andrew, he hit me on the back of my head. He seemed to curse me something, but I couldn't hear it. I saw stars and my eyes were fixed on the Kong. My mother was gasping for air and there was a pool of blood under her body. My brother was twitching uncontrollably like a cat with sickness. Suddenly, a force lifted me up and my father held the file and stabbed it on my face. His hands were shaking, my mouth was in pain, and the stitches broke. Tell me that your brother is healthy and grew up safely. Tell me." My father glared at me and I was shaken into a rag. I uttered the first syllable in a hoarse voice. Only then did my father stop shaking and looked at me with a pious gaze, as if he was looking at a god. "My brother grew up safely without any illness or disaster. In fact, he doesn't need to torture me like this. I am happy to bless my brother. Only if he grows up safely can he become my puppet." I stabbed my father with a sharp blade. For this, I added a blessing. "He will be as strong as an ox." My brother really stopped twitching and my father was overjoyed, holding him in his arms to comfort him. He didn't seem to need my prophecy to work on my mother and just muttered, "My son doesn't seem to have a fever anymore." Taking advantage of the opportunity, I lowered my head and whispered, "Don't let my mother suffer. Die. If I really were a spirit of words, I would let my mother suffer less. If I really am a spirit of words, I will make my father suffer." As soon as I finished speaking, my father was already standing in front of me, holding the needle and thread, and sewed my mouth skillfully. After mumbling to himself, he did not forget to brag, "Which man is as careful as me? I will remember this even if the sky falls." He didn't see that my mother's hands grabbed in the air a few times and then fell heavily. The person may be gone. My father turned over and lay back on the Kong drowsy. His last act of mercy to my mother was just one sentence: "Stop bleeding. I'll take you to the clinic tomorrow morning." I also lay down next to my mother, feeling her slowly stiffening body and watching the sky outside the window turning pale. The rooster had just crowed when the door to my house rang. The sound of dong 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 frightened me inexplicably. My father muttered as he got up from his bed and asked outside, "Who is it?" The person knocking on the door didn't answer the question and shouted in a dry voice, "Open the door." My father and I both stood up. The person who came was my mother's Uncle Oliver, an old man with a sinister look in his eyes. My dad happily welcomed my grandpa Oliver into the house. Oliver lifted the door curtain and walked into the room, squinting at me first. My father rushed to hold my brother under his eyes and said, "Uncle Oliver, look how handsome your grandson is. This is all your blessing." Oliver groaned, pushed my dad away, turned his head to look at my mom, and saw the dried black blood on the Kong. He walked up quickly, touched my mom, and was horrified. "My niece?" My father then noticed something was wrong and scratched his head trying to explain. At this moment, another person came into the room saying, "How unlucky I am that I have to come to your house to see a doctor after getting beaten." It was Andrew who came. The bruises on his face had not yet faded and he looked tired. He rushed home early in the morning and heard Noah tell him that I had knocked on his door in the middle of the night. Thinking about the situation of my mother and brother, he was worried. Although he expressed his dissatisfaction, he rushed over as soon as possible. Oliver let Andrew sit next to my mother. Andrew shook his head and said, "It's gone?" But Grandpa Oliver noticed that he looked strange and asked him further. Andrew rolled his eyes at my dad. "She may have a heavy bleeding, but the amount of bleeding." He hesitated a little, and after Grandpa Oliver repeatedly urged him to assure him, he said vaguely, "Maybe it won't kill me." My dad was stunned for a long time, and then he reacted after hearing this, pointing at Andrew and saying, "What are you talking about? Did you kill my wife?" Oliver glared at my dad, who immediately stopped roaring. "I'm just speculating. The specific cause of death needs to be sent for an autopsy. Don't bother with it if the person is gone." Grandpa Oliver made the decision and sent Andrew away. After he came back, he sat next to my mother, staring at me without saying a word. I felt terrified and my legs went weak like a criminal who had been caught dirty, and I broke out in a cold sweat. After a long while he spoke to my dad. "Stop crying. What a shame." My dad bit his lip and waited for his punishment. Oliver is highly respected in the whole village. He had no children and treated my mother as his own daughter. My father was his nephew-in-law from a neighboring village. No matter how arrogant he was, he acted like a stray dog when he saw Grandpa Oliver. "Give me the rope." Grandpa Oliver was still staring at me, but the pipe hit my dad. My dad shuddered, then immediately took out the red rope for sewing my mouth from the Kong cabinet and handed it to Grandpa Oliver with both hands. Oliver untied the rope, measured it with his hand and glared at my dad. "It moved again?" My dad nodded. "Last night the kid had a fever and was convulsing. Why don't you take care of the fourth daughter?" "The fourth daughter is my mother," and Grandpa Oliver was eager to blame her. His sinister gaze moved from me to my father. After being stared at, my father fell to his knees on the ground, holding my brother above his head. Your eldest grandson was so burned that I lost my mind. Forgot. Oliver narrowed his eyes and I even felt a sharp blade shot out of the gap. He tied a few knots on the rope and tied it around my dad's wrist before slowly saying, "A small punishment but a big warning." After saying that, he hugged my brother and my dad immediately fell to the ground, covering his hands and moaning, "Ouch and ouch." Only then did I understand why Grandpa Oliver was so respected. He looked at my dad for a while, then pulled out a piece of paper and wrote something. Then he handed the paper to me and asked me to go to the village to find a coffin maker. I walked into the yard, my dad's moaning stopped, and Grandpa Oliver said, "Come on." I thought he had forgotten to tell me something, so I turned back, but when I realized he was talking to my dad, I stopped. Oliver said, "Don't let her go for now. After a while, I'll pull out her tongue." Could it be that I cast a curse on my mother and the master found out? My head was spinning and I heard my dad yelling, "No." At the same time, my brother started crying. Using the noise as a cover, I left the house with my feet shaky. The ground is soft, the sun is hot, the wind is sharp. Every step I take, I feel heavy. It seemed that I passed by quite a few people or perhaps some demons. In a daze, I actually walked to the house of the mute woman. I pushed the door open and walked in, hoping to steal some comfort. Strangely, the mute woman was not at home. I didn't dare stay any longer, so I had to write a note, telling him what happened last night and that I couldn't come in the next few days because of the funeral. After writing it, I left the mute woman's house, looking back every few steps, and ran to find the coffin maker. When I returned home after delivering the letter, the mourning tent had already been set up. Oliver handed my brother to me, told me to take good care of him, and then he was busy arranging the funeral arrangements with everyone else. People say congratulations first, then my condolences. For several days in a row, I was very busy and couldn't sleep well. By the third day there were fewer people attending the funeral, and I held my brother and dozed off in front of the coffin. I was still half asleep when I felt someone gently caressing my back. I opened my eyes in a daze and saw the mute woman. The mute woman had tears in her eyes. When she saw me wake up, she hugged me tightly. Before we could exchange words, Grandpa Oliver called me and I heard footsteps coming out of the main room. The mute woman hurriedly stuffed a note in my hand and turned to leave, but she bumped into Grandpa Oliver. I was hidden by the morning shed and couldn't see what was going on. I only heard Grandpa Oliver growl, "What are you doing here?" The mute woman made a whining sound, like a female cat encountering an enemy. "Get out! Don't let me see you again!" Grandpa Oliver shouted and drove him away. I took advantage of the free time to look at the note, which read, "Run. Your mother is dead. Without the blood of the spirit mother to sow your mouth, they will pull out your tongue." I was shocked and broke out in a cold sweat. They pulled out my tongue because they had no more control over me. Hearing Grandpa Oliver's footsteps walking towards the morning shed, I stuffed the note into the coffin through the seam. As soon as my hand left the coffin, Grandpa Oliver appeared. He asked me to follow him, and when he saw me hesitate, he stepped closer and grabbed my ear. "No matter what you are thinking, this tongue must be pulled out today." He dragged me to the kitchen, and my brother's loud crying did not slow him down. After entering the kitchen, he put my brother aside and tied me to the main beam. My father was startled by the crying and rushed over. "What are you looking at? Give me a hand." Grandpa Oliver tied the first knot and felt it was not right, so he ordered. My father did not obey the order, but hugged his thighs and knelt down. "This is not okay." Oliver stopped and I was surprised. Last time he tried to stop me, I just thought I had misheard. Why did he try to stop me again this time? He usually beats and scolds me, so why would he care whether I have a tongue or not? Oliver pushed him away, dragged a stool and sat down and said with interest, "I've told you all the tricks and benefits of this, but you still don't let me pull it out. What's going on?" My father looked around and said, "You have suffered all your life. From now on, I will work like a cow and a horse for you. I promise to make sure you have good food and good drinks." Oliver took out his pipe from his waist and tapped it on my dad's head. "Tell the truth." My dad's back arched and he began to explain, "Before. Someone came to me before and wanted Daisy to say something, saying that they would give me money. Her mother hadn't given birth yet at that time, and I was afraid that it would damage Daisy's ability and delay your grandchildren, so I didn't agree. In the past few days, several people have asked me for this favor, and the money they gave is enough for the two of us to squander for a year. Please have mercy on me and keep this path. My grandson will need money to go to school, build a house and get married." My father picked up my brother and held him in his hands and put him in Grandpa Oliver's arms. "This is your only grandson." This pushing and shaking made my brother laugh so hard. Oliver looked at his son smile, and a smile actually appeared on his haggard face, but it looked so ugly, like crying. He hesitated for a moment. "There's only a little bit of sewing rope left. What should we do in the future?" My father got angry, stood up and pinched my face. His hands were covered with calluses and his grip was so strong that I felt like he was going to crush me. But his words were stronger than his grip. He said, "Take the fishing line. Change it 3 times a day and lock her up again. If it doesn't work, beat her until she obeys." At this point, he let go of her hand, lowered his head and asked me with a smile, "Daisy, you are an obedient daughter, right?" His smile is like a devil. I nodded with tears in my eyes. The old beast actually developed a love for his calf. He sighed, "We can only do it once every 2 weeks at most. If we find something wrong, we will immediately—" Before Grandpa Oliver could finish, my dad swore to heaven, "Whatever you say is true, you are the one who speaks." That's settled. My father checked the remaining seam rope and calculated that it would be enough for 3 times, a month and a half. After my mother was buried, Master Oliver came home. He said he would go back and pack his things while he still had something to hold me down, and move to my house in case I made any unusual moves. Before leaving, he hung a piece of tattered red cloth on the gate of the courtyard as a sign. Many people come to my house, but they all come to ask about the rules, and no one offers real money to ask for help. My dad wasn't in a very good mood, and he rarely smiled even when he saw my brother. He just watched me very closely and even tied me up when I slept. Until one day Aunt Vera came. As soon as she entered the room, she knelt in front of my dad and said, "My husband fell badly at the construction site and is in the ICU. Money is being spent like water. Please ask Daisy to say something and save my husband." Aunt Vera took out a red book and stuffed it into my dad's hand. "This is all the money we have left. I'll give it to you. If it's not enough, I'll write you an IOU." My father opened the red book and took a look at it, his face flushed. "Enough? Since you are starting a business, I'll give you a discount." He called me over, reminded me what to say, threatened me a few more times and then picked up my sewing rope. Vera looked at me straight in the eye for the first time and immediately kowtowed. "Aunt Yenling, please give me the words." I thought it was funny, but I kept a straight face and said word by word, "Your old man will be in good health and will be discharged from the hospital as soon as possible." Vera kowtowed again, wailed and swore at me and my father, saying that she would come to thank us in person after her husband was discharged from the hospital. I want to thank her. Her loud voice just covers up my true feelings. My dad has become hard of hearing. My dad didn't care about coming to thank me, he just asked for the password to the passbook. Aunt Vera muttered a string of numbers under her breath. What? My father raised his voice and moved closer. After several attempts, Aunt Vera had no choice but to write the password on the ground. After sending her away, my father sewed my mouth with a smile. He drank a lot that night and didn't bother to tie me up, so he went to bed early. I finally had the chance to sneak out and find the mute woman. But when we got to her house, we found that one of her legs was broken. Under the dim light, the mute woman's withered face was full of pain, and her right leg was in a cast. When she saw me, she propped herself up, which affected her wound. She couldn't help but gasp, but immediately forced a smile. She picked up the teapot to pour me some water, but the pot was empty. I held her down, put down my crying brother, turned to light the fire, wiped away her tears, and made some hot noodle soup and served it on the Kong table. Only after watching her take the first bite did we finally come together and start communicating. The scraping sound of pencil on paper became more and more urgent. I wanted to know the full extent of her injury, and she wanted to know my safety and well-being. After a few words, the topic focused on my grandpa Oliver. I then realized that although the mute woman looked old, she was actually in her 40s. Her mother and my grandpa Oliver were once lovers. At that time they were all 15 or 16 years old. After they got engaged, Grandpa Oliver left the village to make a living, saying that he wanted to earn some money to marry the mute mother in a grand manner. Less than half a year later, Grandpa Oliver came back and brought a young man with him, saying mysteriously that he had a great opportunity. Oliver sent the mute woman's mother to the young man's bed, which led to an evil relationship, and the mute woman was born. The mute woman started to sew her mouth when she was 2 years old. At the age of 4, she was taken to another mountain village by her so-called father and sold to a wealthy family in the village. In order to make the dumb woman obedient, the young man said that her mother was still in the hands of Grandpa Oliver. Every year, the young man sent hemp ropes for sewing mouths to the rich and received a sum of money. One year someone came and there was no rope. He told the rich man that the mute woman's mother had died and that without her mother's blood, she could no longer make ropes, so it was up to the rich man to decide how to deal with the mute woman. The mute woman overheard this conversation and was heartbroken. She only wanted to meet her mother in the underworld. The rich man's wife showed some mercy and only allowed the mute woman to have her tongue pulled out and kicked her out of the house. "If you want to seek revenge, don't blame my family. It was Vera's family that hurt you." The idea that the rich man's daughter-in-law was acquitted gave the mute woman new obsession. She crossed mountains and rivers to find it, firstly to find her mother's relics, and secondly to die together with my grandpa Oliver so that he could not hurt anyone again. But she was weak after all and could not risk her life, so she could only look for an opportunity to poison my grandpa Oliver's food. After meeting me, things changed. She started looking for a small file or other things that could help me at my grandfather Oliver's house. It was almost broken several times. Grandpa Oliver was always at my house a while ago, so she gave her some time to sneak into the cellar of Grandpa Oliver's house. There were signs of people living there and there was a manuscript. The manuscript talked about how to make and use words, and also wrote about how to make a file. The mute woman was afraid that she could not remember it correctly, so she stole the things with courage. But as soon as she left, she was discovered by Oliver's grandfather. He chased her home, snatched the book, and broke the mute woman's leg. "I'm keeping you alive because of your relationship with your mother. If you dare to cause trouble again, I'll reunite you and your daughter." Oliver left after saying something harsh, but he paid Andrew to treat him. Why did he ask the doctor to come? I can't figure it out. The mute woman touched her dry eye sockets. I looked at the rhubarb skins neatly stacked by the bed and instantly understood Master Oliver's intention. He knew I was in contact with the mute woman and he was threatening me. I hated him more than I hated my parents. I wanted him to die without a burial place. Thinking that my father was drunk and asleep, it was a good opportunity to steal the file and talk. I stood up and tried to leave, but the door of the mute woman's house was kicked open. 2 figures rushed through the door and dragged 2 evil spirits in. My dad and Grandpa Oliver. "You bastard, I know your mind is not at home. If someone hadn't heard your brother crying, it would have been hard to find you. My father grabbed my collar and yelled at me, the foul smell from his breath hitting my face. You're shameless. If you want to die, I will grant your wish. Grandpa Oliver dragged the dumb woman, and his peripheral vision fell on the notebook on the table. From the densely packed conversation he saw the key. He kicked the dumb woman and turned around to slap me. You want me to die? Master Oliver laughed and pointed at the dumb woman. This bitch, her first prophecy was to ensure that I would live 100 years. Don't regret what you said, have you heard it? Master Oliver's laughter was more unpleasant than the cry of a crow. My father frowned and listened carefully, but he couldn't hear clearly, so he shouted, Uncle Oliver, what are you talking about? Oliver stared at me fiercely without smiling, his hawk-like eyes seemed to pierce through me. The dumb woman screamed on and ah, and stood up several times to fight for her life with Grandpa Oliver, but was pushed down every time. With the last blow, the mute woman hit her head against the wall and stopped moving. I struggled hard but couldn't break free. Oliver chuckled, even though your father is a loser, there is a price to pay for murdering your own father. He climbed onto the Kong, grabbed the mute woman, and slammed her against the wall by her hair. If I can create one word spirit, I can create 2 or 3. Don't think you are something rare. If you listen to me, you can live. If you don't, you will die. My dad looked at Grandpa Oliver with a horrified expression and asked, What are you doing? Don't let anyone get killed. Don't worry. Nothing can be accomplished without a ruthless heart. I was furious and tried to twist my body but couldn't get free. But I couldn't just stand by and watch the dumb woman suffer, so I tried to open my mouth, and used my hands to pry and pull the thread. The severe pain went straight from the lips to the top of the head, hot liquid gushed out from every hole, and the throat made a cracking sound. Everything in front of my eyes became darker and darker. Ah! I screamed, and the restraint on my lips disappeared. The two of them looked at me, maybe I looked more like a ghost at this moment. My father let go of his hand and took 2 steps back. I laughed and saw Grandpa Oliver rushing towards me. It's too late. As I dodged, I cursed with the most sincere heart. You'll be paralyzed in bed, eating stale food, drinking dirty water, rotting in feces, and maggots will crawl all over you. Grandpa Oliver grabbed me, covered my mouth, and was about to slam me into the stove. I finished mumbling all the curses. Maggots will crawl all over you and you'll live forever. Just as I was within arm's length of the stove, my dad pushed Grandpa Oliver from the side. Grandpa Oliver was caught off guard and hit his head on the sharp corner. With a swished sound, he fell heavily, and the kettle on the stove tipped over and poured all over his face, washing away the blood that was flowing out. Oliver wailed miserably a few times, then fell to the ground, twitching constantly, proving that he was still alive. I glared at my father fiercely. He was so scared that he told me to ask Andrew to come and see the mute woman, and then turned and ran away. I was afraid that he wouldn't come back, so I stayed by the mute woman's side. My eyes kept falling on my brother, and even though he was screaming and wailing, he didn't wake up. He seemed to be having a sweet dream and occasionally laughed out loud. The mute woman's house was bustling as never before. Andrew saw this and suggested calling the police and sending the man to the hospital, but he was stopped by the village chief, who rushed over. Everyone in the village condoned what Grandpa Oliver did to me and the mute woman. The whole village is in darkness. Besides, the village chief's prestige has always been suppressed by Grandpa Oliver, and he is happy to see this scene now. Time passed quickly and the rags on my gate turned pink. Those who used to bully and humiliate me now bow and scrape to me. Every day people come to my house to give me gifts, hoping that I will give them some words. I picked and chose and managed some people and saved a lot of money. My father is very afraid of me now, and treats me rudely at first and then respectfully like a slave. He would go to Grandpa Oliver's house every 2 days to bring food to the old man paralyzed in bed, just as a way of fulfilling his filial duty. When he got home, he told my brother about his disgust for Grandpa Oliver. My brother was already 7 years old and he was tired of hearing this for 7 years, so he ran around the yard to hide. My father chased him around the yard with a loud voice, and the neighbors could hear it clearly. I took the mute woman in to live with me, and she also advised me that I should leave the village now that I was no longer restricted. Start a new life far away from home. You predicted your father's fate and it will definitely come true. There's no need to gamble your future by having to see it with your own eyes. After the mute woman finished writing, she looked at me worriedly. I shook my head, took the book and wrote stroke by stroke. I want to see the retribution in this life, but more importantly, the handwritten copy you mentioned is still missing. I didn't tell you about this before because I didn't want to worry the mute woman, but I recently discovered some clues. Please keep an eye on my dad. He's been going to Oliver's grandpa's house too often lately. He is not a filial son. He obviously has other intentions for running twice a day. The mute woman looked at me thoughtfully for a while and nodded heavily. I tore off the paper and stuffed it into the fire pit. This is a new habit of mine, and I doubt my dad has seen the page with the manuscript that night. Finally, one day my dad came back from delivering food with a big smile on his face. He asked for leave from me, saying he was going to town for a few days to buy seeds. Now was not the time to farm, and I didn't know what he was up to, but I agreed. That night I cooked a delicious meal and sent my brother to buy some wine. At the dinner table, the mute woman kept urging us to drink. Since the last time he got drunk, my dad has rarely touched alcohol in recent years. He was cautious at first, but he couldn't hold his liquor well, and after a few drinks he was drunk and unconscious. But I didn't find the manuscript on him. The next day I let him go and went to Grandpa Oliver's house. Oliver had become so thin that he looked like a skeleton, but unlike before, his 2 eyes were actually shining brightly on his skeleton-like body. When I came before, we tacitly ignored him. But this time, as soon as I walked in, he shouted hoarsely that I was dead. I also lost my patience and said directly, "You will tell me where the manuscript is hidden?" I didn't ask before because I was sure that using prophecies too much would backfire. The fact that the mute woman is decades older than she looks is a living example. Oliver couldn't resist and uttered each word with tears in his eyes, "In the Kong hole." After he said that, he coughed up a mouthful of black blood, and his bright eyes dimmed again. The chapter on creating the word spirit in the booklet was stained with many black fingerprints. It was my father's habit to wet his fingers before turning the pages of a book. The charcoal gray fingerprints were enough to prove that he had read it. And he was most likely going out this time to find Xan Yinling's biological father. I just didn't expect that he would find him so quickly. My dad knocked on the door in the middle of the night, happily leading a fat, earless man. "This is my cousin. Look how similar we look." My dad pointed at his deformed little ears. In the past he felt inferior because of his small ears, but now he is showing off like this simply because it is a necessary characteristic of Yinling's biological father. The mute woman pulled my sleeve and stood in front of me, like an old cat protecting its cubs. I pointed to the sky, showed her the full moon without clouds, and gently stroked her stiff arm. The word spirit must be nurtured on the first day of the lunar month when there is no moon. My father brought people back at this moment just to show off recklessly and stupidly. Back in the house, I looked through the manuscript again and confirmed once again that the date of conception was an absolute necessary condition, and then I relaxed a little. He really has no brains, I thought to myself. Just then my brother opened my door. Although he was only 8 years old, he was already tall and strong as a calf. He held the bowl and handed it to me like offering a treasure. "Poached egg soup, I made it, try it." He has been tinkering in the kitchen these days and didn't let me and the mute woman go in to help. It turned out to be because of this. Whenever he was sick, I would make him poached egg soup. "You've lost a lot of weight recently." "I'm worried." He looked at me with wet eyes. My younger brother was spoiled to death by my father, and relying on my status, he beat dogs and chased chickens in the village, and he never lost in fights with older kids. She is only obedient and docile in front of me and the mute woman. My heart warmed, I held him in my arms, drank the soup and ate the eggs in one go. It tastes really bad, the taste is sweet but salty and the eggs are undercooked. It is also really warm, and the warmth is conveyed through the limbs like ants walking around. I began to regret the curse I placed on him when he was still a fetus. The warmth made me feel dizzy, and I wanted to send him away, flipping through the book to see if I could bear the retribution of withdrawing the prophecy. But before I had time to speak, my vision went dark and I fainted. Vaguely, I heard the crowing of chickens and the cawing of cats. I wanted to move but couldn't even open my eyes. The mute woman's dry roar was blocked outside the door, and there was no movement after a moment. Someone put tape on my mouth, took off my clothes and tied my hands and feet. A slimy and cold person pressed against me, and the smell of blood was pungent. I only had one thought in my mind: why would my brother whom I raised do this? The person on my body moved and I suffered like dead meat. Why can't I just die completely? At least my wandering soul won't be coveted and plotted against by others. Suddenly there was a loud noise outside the window, and it sounded like it came from the direction of the kitchen. The person on top of him paused, turned around and asked, "What's going on?" My dad said sternly, "Don't worry about it. Why are you so cowardly?" Seeing that the person on his body had not moved, he added an explanation: "I locked my stupid son in the kitchen. I guess he was the one who made the noise." As soon as he finished speaking, my brother came running from the kitchen, roaring, "You hurt my sister, I will kill you." My father yelled, "You want a rebel? Put down the knife." My heart tightened as the prophecy was about to come true at this moment. I didn't care about any backlash or retribution. I muttered something like, "My brother wouldn't kill anyone," but my mouth was glued tightly shut and all the words were stuck on the tip of my tongue, unable to come out. If you can't speak, how can you follow the law? I was so anxious that my chest felt stuffy, but I couldn't struggle and I fainted again. When I woke up again, I had strength back and opened my eyes to see my brother's bloodshot eyes. There were also blood stains on his body, like a devil from hell. Seeing me wake up, he forced out an ugly smile and said with a choked voice, "I'm sorry, sister, I lied. I can't make the fried egg soup well, and Dad said he would help." I tried hard to wipe the blood off his face, but I couldn't get rid of the thought in my mind. "I'm sorry." My voice was hoarse and for the first time my words followed my heart. 23. The incident was so serious that the village chief could no longer cover it up and called the police. My father and the unknown young man were hacked to death and the first blow was fatal. The police found it hard to accept that my brother, who was less than 10 years old, could do such a thing. But no one else was there that night, and I couldn't commit the crime because I had a lethal amount of sleeping pills in my body. The mute woman was knocked unconscious and has not woken up since then. Because the mountain road is difficult to walk, she was placed in the village clinic. After a few days of investigation, my brother was detained and I was sent back to the village. Because my home was the crime scene and I couldn't go back, I shamelessly went to find Andrew and stayed at the clinic under the pretext of taking care of the mute woman. Andrew knew what I was thinking but he didn't expose me. He brought my food for 3 meals a day. Andrew piled the meat, which was not much, on top of my bowl and said, "It's bitter, baby." I wanted to say some words of blessing several times, but he interrupted me as soon as I opened my mouth. He said solemnly, "If you don't earn it yourself, it's not right, don't accept it." I had seen the word integrity in a book, but I didn't understand it for a long time. But I saw the meaning in Andrew. Under Andrew's careful care, the mute woman woke up. I discussed with her about leaving the village and starting a new life somewhere unknown. The mute woman nodded and asked for paper and pen to write something. But just as I wrote the word read, a group of people, led by the village chief, rushed to the clinic with a clamor. The village chief pushed Andrew aside and ran straight to me. Without saying a word, Aunt Vera grabbed my hands and feet, her daughter-in-law taped my mouth and pushed me out. The others followed behind, carrying the mute woman. "What are you doing? The mute woman isn't well yet, she can't leave." Andrew hurried over to stop them. The village chief snorted, "Don't worry about this matter, just take care of your own business." "What do you mean don't worry about it? You took my patient away?" The village chief was very impatient and gave the idle man in the village a look. The idle man got the order and quickly tied up the village doctor. 24. Without any obstruction, the group marched toward the square in a mighty procession. The village chief held his chicken-killing knife and walked around me, laughing from time to time. "Daisy, I want to discuss a business with you." The village chief held the knife in front of me. My mouth was sealed and I couldn't speak. He didn't want to wait for my reaction and continued, "From now on, listen to me. You have to say whatever I tell you to say. I promise you two will have good food and drink. Otherwise, the dumb old woman will not feel good." After the village chief said this, all the aunts and uncles became unhappy. Vera's daughter-in-law took the lead and said, "What the village chief said is not fair. We have all contributed and he should listen to all of us." The idle man said in a loud voice, "That's right. The benefits are for everyone." The village chief reluctantly agreed to appease them, and then everyone looked at me attentively. I glanced at them and was surprised to find that these people were the ones who had asked me for gifts but were rejected. Some of them want to have 3 wives and 4 concubines without being discovered, some want a successful career in their careers and some want a lot of wealth. These are all wishful and terrible things. Through the gaps in the crowd, I saw the mute woman leaning against a tree, her face flushed and looking very uncomfortable, but she kept making squeaky sounds and shaking her head. Of course she wanted to stop me, I understand. But I tilted my head to look at the village chief and nodded. The village chief was delighted and asked, "Are you listening?" The idle man was quick and nimble and he immediately tore off the tape on my face. "Let me make a fortune, $1 million. While saying this he pretended to rub my chest unintentionally. The village chief wanted to stop me but it was too late. I grinned, my voice hoarse as if it had been rusted. Some people took a few steps back in fear, and the hands that were holding me loosened. I opened my mouth to speak. Everyone came forward again with courage, wanting to hear the truth. The sky was cloudy and rainy, and lightning struck everyone in the square. Whether it was good or bad, what I said never fell through, and these people naturally knew it. Seeing the dark clouds approaching, the timid uncles and aunts ran away in all directions, cursing as they ran. The brave idler covered my mouth in panic. I took a step back and pointed at him, "Break your offspring before you die." But taking a step back caused a pain in my back. After he finished speaking, he looked back and saw the village chief standing behind him. He was clenching his teeth and yelled, "You're such a jerk. I'll kill you." As he spoke, thunder rolled and lightning flashed across the sky. The pain grew deeper and deeper as if piercing my body. I wanted the village chief to be the first to experience the power of the prophecy, but my lips and tongue were stiff. I used my last bit of strength to look at the dumb woman and said the last words of my life. "May the dumb woman be safe and healthy, live a long and happy life." I didn't die. It was Andrew who saved me. After the village chief and his men tied me up and left, Andrew smashed the mirror and cut the rope despite his hand injury. After calling the police, he rushed to the square in the rain and wind. He watched as bolts of lightning struck, chasing the fleeing people. As the idler was running away, his foot tripped and his lower body hit the sharp rocks. Looking at the hellish scene on earth, he was also terrified, but he found that the lightning was not aimed at him. He found me among the corpses, seriously injured. Strangely enough, an hour ago I was still a girl. When Andrew found me again, I was already old and full of wrinkles. Andrew and the mute woman carried me back to the clinic. They took care of me for more than a month and I gradually got better. One sunny day, while Andrew was seeing patients, I stuffed most of my savings from the years into the drawer where he collected medical fees. Then we left and went deep into the mountains. The mute woman and I had agreed long ago that we would live deep in the mountains and live in seclusion from the outside world. When we were climbing the mountain, the mute woman was very agile and left me behind several times. I grinned when I remembered what she said about raising some chickens and sheep, and growing wheat in morning glories. The days passed quickly and cleanly, and were very comfortable. But sometimes I dream that I am reading and I still feel regret.